One of the greatest cities in the ancient world left no readable political autobiography. That is the first and most unsettling fact about Teotihuacan. Not a mythic village. Not a provincial shrine. At its height, this metropolis may have housed roughly 100,000 to 200,000 people, placing it among the largest urban centers on Earth in its era. Its pyramids still dominate the imagination. Its monumental avenues still impose order on the map. Its influence still appears far beyond central Mexico, all the way into the dynastic storms of the Maya world. And yet the men and women who directed this immense urban machine remain almost faceless to history. I am Professor Adrian Lockewell, and this is where the investigation begins, not with a king's boast, but with a silence so complete that it has become evidence. That silence is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. In most ancient civilizations, power introduces itself loudly. Kings carve their names into stone. Dynasties list their victories, marriages, rituals, and conquests. Success becomes autobiography. Teotihuacan refuses that pattern. Archaeological evidence, not readable native chronicles, carries the argument here. The city speaks through its streets, its compounds, its burials, its murals, its obsidian, and the distant traces it left in other political worlds. The rulers remain nearly faceless, and that absence forces a larger question than any single inscription ever could: was the city hiding its leaders, or had the system become so powerful that the institution mattered more than the individual? That question is not a footnote. It is the central mystery. Centuries later, the Aztecs encountered the ruins and gave the place the name by which it is now known, commonly translated as the place where the gods were made, or more loosely associated with divine creation. That does not mean the Aztecs knew nothing of the site in some simple modern sense. It means they inherited a sacred ruin and interpreted it through myth, memory, and political imagination. To them, Teotihuacan was not merely abandoned masonry. It was a cosmic landmark, a place where origins seemed to linger in stone long after the original state had vanished. And the original inhabitants' own name for the city is still unknown. That fact should trouble any historian. A society capable of shaping regional destiny left behind a built environment of extraordinary scale, but no surviving public voice that clearly says, this is who ruled, this is how power worked, this is what we called ourselves. The archive is incomplete, and the incompleteness is revealing. It suggests either deliberate concealment, later destruction, or an institutional style in which the city spoke through order rather than through royal self-display. That is why Teotihuacan is not just an archaeological site. It is a strategic problem. It was not a passive ceremonial center sitting at the edge of history. It was an actor. It reorganized central Mexican life. It drew labor, artisans, merchants, and possibly migrants from across the region. It projected influence deep into the Maya world, where other cities recorded contact with powers whose names, motives, and methods are still debated by scholars. Whatever Teotihuacan's exact political form, the surviving pattern points towards something larger than a local kingdom. This was a city that could create gravity. Smaller polities had to respond to it, whether by resisting, imitating, accommodating, or entering its orbit. That is the deeper reason Teotihuacan matters. Not because it is mysterious in a shallow, romantic sense, but because its mystery sits at the center of power itself. How does a civilization become so influential that it helps reshape the political geography of ancient America, and yet remain politically silent? Was the silence a loss, a concealment, or a deliberate strategy? Did the city elevate institutions above personalities so completely that rulers became almost unnecessary as public symbols? Or did later catastrophe erase a record that once existed? The evidence suggests that the answer cannot be found in one inscription or one buried chamber. It must be built from patterns: the layout of the city, the density of its housing, the organization of its labor, the reach of its trade, and the echoes of its prestige in distant courts. In other words, Teotihuacan must be studied not as a ruined monument, but as a political system that once converted space, belief, and population into continental influence. And that is where the real investigation begins. Because Teotihuacan did not rise by accident. It rose because the Valley of Mexico was a strategic engine waiting for a system capable of mastering it. The city's silence is only the first clue. The next question is far larger: what kind of terrain could produce a superpower that learned to rule without leaving its rulers behind? The silence is not the whole mystery. The first clue is the basin itself. Teotihuacan did not rise in a vacuum or on the edge of civilization. It emerged in the northeastern basin of Mexico, inside a crowded strategic corridor where settlements, ritual centers, farming zones, springs, and exchange routes all pressed against one another. That mattered. In ancient Mesoamerica, power was rarely a matter of one dynasty simply inheriting a throne. Power had to be assembled from resources, managed through ritual, defended through organization, and justified through cosmic language. Springs mattered. Arable land mattered. Obsidian corridors mattered. Even the volcanic landscape mattered, because here the sacred and the strategic were never separate categories. A place that could feed people, attract merchants, anchor ritual, and protect itself could become more than a city. It could become a magnet. That is why the Valley of Mexico became such a fierce arena of concentration. Populations did not gather there by accident. They gathered because the basin offered leverage, water in a highland environment where water was never guaranteed, fertile margins for cultivation, routes that linked distant regions, and a symbolic geography that made authority feel older than any living ruler. Mountain, cave, spring, crater, and volcano were not decorative elements of the landscape. They were claims about legitimacy. They told people where life came from, where fertility emerged, and where the human world touched the divine. To command such a geography was to command the language through which society explained itself. In that sense, the basin was already a political instrument before Teotihuacan became famous. The surviving pattern points toward a region of intense competition, where cult centers, markets, and elite factions had to adapt to changing conditions rather than rest inside a stable order. Earlier centers such as Coahuilco occupied important positions in this wider world. Then came the disruptions associated with Zittel, a volcanic force whose exact political consequences remain debated by archaeologists. The evidence suggests upheaval, but not a simple one city destroyed another city rises formula. Human history is rarely that neat. Still, volcanic disruption, environmental stress, and regional reorganization clearly altered the balance of power. When older centers weakened, migration, competition, and opportunistic consolidation became possible. That is the deeper pattern. Teotihuacan was not merely built on favorable ground, it was built inside a crisis of rearrangement. As the late 1st millennium BC gave way to the early 1st millennium AD, central Mexico was undergoing wider transformations in urbanism, trade, and elite rivalry. Small centers could no longer rely on isolation. Markets expanded. Craft specialists became more valuable. Ritual authority had to be centralized or outmaneuvered. Food had to move farther and be distributed more deliberately. Labor had to be organized on a scale that scattered settlements could not easily match. In that environment, urban concentration was not just growth. It was a strategy. A large city could gather labor into one system, regulate food distribution, attract artisans, coordinate craft production, and bind diverse populations to a shared sacred order. It could turn geography into administration. It could turn abundance into leverage. And because so much of legitimacy in Mesoamerica depended on the relationship between the human community and the powers beneath mountains, inside caves, and around water sources, Teotihuacan's rise was also a victory in symbolic politics. Sacred geography was not a superstition layered over reality. It was political infrastructure. It told people that order had roots deeper than any single ruler, deeper even than any living institution. That is why one line captures the whole basin so well. In Mesoamerica, geography did not merely host power, it argued for power. Once that argument began to favor Teotihuacan, the city did not simply occupy space. It organized space. It turned the valley's pressures into a system of concentration, and that system would soon reach beyond the basin itself. The next question is not why a megacity could emerge here. The next question is how such a city was engineered to convert landscape into obedience, and obedience into history. Once the Valley of Mexico had become a strategic cockpit, Teotihuacan revealed its true genius. It did not merely occupy space, it organized space into obedience. This was not urban sprawl, it was an operating system. The city's great central axis, later called the Avenue of the Dead, was not a road of corpses but a ceremonial and political spine. It staged movement. It controlled sightlines. It turned processions into arguments about rank, divine favor, and civic order. Along that spine rose the Pyramid of the Sun, among the largest pyramidal structures in the ancient Americas, and the Pyramid of the Moon, each one less a monument in the modern sense than a declaration of scale. These were not decorative landmarks. They were instruments of political theater, built to make the city feel inevitable. Then came the Ciudadela, and inside that enclosed complex, the temple modern scholars call the Feathered Serpent Pyramid. Here, power was not hidden in a palace behind the curtain of the state. It was dramatized in public ritual, fused with sacred symbolism, and placed where the city itself had to confront it. That was the Teotihuacan method, not simply to rule, but to stage rule as cosmic order. The architecture spoke in talatablero, the sloping panelan platform style that became a recognizable Teotihuacan visual language. Its importance lay in repetition. In ancient politics, style was never just style. A city that could standardize monumental form could standardize labor, ideology, and memory. Tablero did not merely decorate Teotihuacan, it carried Teotihuacan outward. Wherever that form appeared beyond the basin, it signaled prestige, emulation, contact, or influence, sometimes all at once. The building style itself became a political signature, a way of announcing that this order, this discipline, this vision of urban authority, had weight beyond the city walls. But the deepest revolution was not only in temples. It was in housing. Teotihuacan is famous for its apartment compounds, dense, standardized, multi-family residential complexes that housed much of the population. That matters because it reveals something far more sophisticated than simple crowding. The city did not leave its people scattered in weak, improvised neighborhoods. It organized them into planned social units. Kinship could be concentrated there. Craft production could be supervised there. Ethnic communities could be grouped there. Local identity could be folded into a larger urban machine. In Teotihuacan, walls were not just boundaries, they were administrative tools. This implies an extraordinary level of coordination. Surveying had to be deliberate. Labor had to be mobilized at scale. Ritual planning had to align with architecture. Food distribution had to sustain a population that was no longer a village and not yet a modern city, but something closer to a controlled civilization of tens of thousands. Every avenue, platform, and compound points toward the same conclusion: some authority, or some coalition of authorities, possessed the power to impose order on vast human effort and then present that order as natural. And yet the strangest fact remains the silence. Compared with Maya cities, where kings advertised themselves through stelae and inscriptions, Teotihuacan leaves no obvious gallery of royal faces. The Maya carved names, lineages, victories, accessions, and divine descent into stone. Teotihuacan offers something colder: monumentality without a readable autobiography. That absence has forced archaeologists into a serious debate. The evidence suggests several competing models. There may have been divine kingship, but if so, the record of those rulers has not survived in the same way Maya royal records did. There may have been collective rule, corporate authority, or councils of elites whose power was distributed rather than concentrated in a single sovereign. Priestly and military factions may have shared influence. Neighborhood-based power brokers may have operated beneath a central ideological umbrella. What matters is not simply the uncertainty, but what that uncertainty reveals. In Teotihuacan, anonymity may itself have been a strategy. A ruler's face is vulnerable. An institution's face can feel eternal. By suppressing the individual, the state may have projected something larger than a king, a civic order that seemed to arise from the cosmos rather than from a mortal household. That is the chilling brilliance of Teotihuacan. It may have made authority feel impersonal, sacred, and permanent. So the city becomes more than a skyline. It becomes a system of control disguised as harmony, a machine that converted planning into legitimacy. Once that is understood, the next question becomes unavoidable: what fed such a machine, what flowed through its workshops and markets, and what kinds of power moved through its foreign quarters like invisible currents beneath the stone? To answer that, the investigation must leave the ceremonial spine and follow the economic arteries that kept the whole city alive: obsidian, craft industries, exchange networks, and the intelligence hidden inside trade. Once the city's grid had disciplined labor and ritual space, the next question was no longer architectural. It was logistical. What, exactly, made Teotihuacan worth serving? The answer begins with a material that was not quite stone at all. Obsidian, volcanic glass, was the sharp edge of Mesoamerican life. It became blades, scrapers, projectile points, ritual instruments, and prestige objects. In a world without iron or steel, obsidian was not a luxury add-on. It was a strategic necessity. Whoever controlled its flow controlled the making of tools, the arming of bodies, and the production of sacred objects that made authority visible. And Teotihuacan sat at a decisive point in that system. The evidence suggests that it did not merely consume obsidian, it organized it. Nearby sources mattered, but none became more closely associated with the city's reach than Pachuca green obsidian, prized for its color, quality, and visual brilliance. That glass did not simply circulate. It moved through Teotihuacan-linked distribution networks, entering workshops, households, and distant ceremonial contexts. A blade of obsidian could cut flesh, a network of obsidian could cut into the politics of an entire region. That distinction is the key to understanding the city. Teotihuacan was not only a place of temples and avenues. It was a craft production powerhouse. Ceramics moved through its economy in enormous quantities. Figurines, incense burners, mural programs, shell ornaments, mica, and other luxury goods reveal a city that had learned how to transform regional resources into symbolic authority. Production was not scattered or accidental. It was organized, specialized, and scalable. That is the signature of a political order that understood a central truth: prestige is manufactured as carefully as pottery. The scale of this system matters because it blurs the line between economy and statecraft. In Teotihuacan, exchange was not a neutral background activity. It was one of the main instruments of power. Markets were not merely places where goods changed hands, they were intelligence systems. Traders carried news as well as cargo. They knew which courts were stable, which marriage alliances were under negotiation, which communities had surplus maize, which rival center was arming itself, and which frontier was becoming anxious. Every exchange was also reconnaissance. Every merchant route was a sensor line across the ancient landscape. This is why Teotihuacan's influence likely operated through layered mechanisms rather than a single blunt one. Trade dominance mattered. Religious prestige mattered. Military intimidation likely mattered in some contexts. Elite fashion mattered, because rulers in distant places could borrow Teotihuacan styles and clothe themselves in borrowed legitimacy. And at moments, selective intervention may have mattered as well. The city's power did not need to look like a marching empire to behave like one. It could move through contracts, ceremonies, gifts, workshops, and the quiet pressure of dependency. The archaeological record also points toward a far more complicated urban population than a simple ethnic core ruling everyone else. Foreign districts and neighborhoods associated with outsiders have been identified, including the Oaxaca barrio and evidence of Maya connections. These should not be imagined as modern embassies with neatly documented diplomatic functions. The surviving pattern points towards something subtler and more powerful: managed multiculturalism. Some communities may have been merchants. Some may have been artisans brought in for specialized work. Some may have been hostages, clients, settlers, or families attached to strategic exchange. The city may have used diversity the way states use infrastructure: quietly, constantly, and for leverage. That possibility changes the meaning of Teotihuacan's scale. The city did not simply attract people. It converted movement into hierarchy. It made artisans dependent on supply lines, merchants dependent on access, and outsiders dependent on the great urban machine's capacity to protect, redistribute, and sanctify exchange. In that sense, Teotihuacan behaved less like a conventional kingdom and more like an imperial operating system hiding inside a marketplace. And the larger lesson is almost unsettling in its simplicity. When a city controls the flow of materials, it begins to control the flow of information. When it controls information, it begins to shape political reality itself. Obsidian was not only a substance. It was a medium of leverage. Workshops were not only places of production. They were institutions of coordination. Foreign neighborhoods were not only signs of diversity. They were evidence that the city had learned how to absorb difference without losing command. This is why Teotihuacan's economic power cannot be separated from its strategic intelligence. The city did not merely exchange goods across Mesoamerica. It mapped power, anticipated pressure, and turned circulation into influence. The next frontier is inevitable. Once exchange becomes leverage, it must be explained, justified, and blessed. The gods enter the ledger. The ritual calendar enters the economy. And the machine of Teotihuacan begins to reveal its next and most terrifying layer. Trade explains how power traveled, religion explains why power felt inevitable. In Teotihuacan, the sacred was not a decorative layer placed over politics. It was the mechanism that made politics survivable, legible, and obeyable. The city's iconography speaks in a dense visual grammar of storm, water, fertility, mountains, caves, serpents, jaguars, owls, and supernatural authority. These were not isolated symbols drifting above daily life. They were public claims about how reality itself was structured, and who possessed the right to mediate between human society and the forces that could sustain or destroy it. Mountains and caves mattered because they were thresholds. In Mesoamerican thought, they were places where rain emerged, where earth opened, where fertility was born from hidden depths, and where divine power entered the world. Water was not a poetic theme, it was continuity, harvest, and survival inside a basin society that depended on disciplined agriculture and coordinated distribution. Storm imagery implied command over forces no household could control. Serpents, jaguars, and owls carried their own logic of authority, movement between worlds, predation, night vision, elite danger, and supernatural vigilance. Taken together, these images created a moral universe in which Teotihuacan did not merely occupy space. It occupied the center of meaning. And then there is the feathered serpent pyramid, where the evidence suggests something more severe than simple devotion. Archaeologists uncovered mass sacrificial burials there, including individuals associated with military symbolism, warriors, or people deliberately presented in martial form. The pattern points toward a fusion of dedication, warfare, and sacred power. This was not random brutality. It was political theology made tangible in bone, architecture, and ritual space. In the ancient Mesoamerican world, sacrifice communicated at a scale that ordinary law could not match. It told elites that power carried cosmic responsibility. It told the population that order was maintained at a cost that reached beyond human bookkeeping. It told rivals, and perhaps subjects, that Teotihuacan's authority was not merely administrative. It was metaphysical. The city made obedience cosmic. That is the key to its durability. A city can extract labor through coercion, taxation, and bureaucracy. But it can endure far longer when labor feels embedded in the structure of the universe. Teotihuacan's murals, processions, and ceremonial spaces all helped manufacture that feeling. Across the apartment compounds, mural programs and household art formed a shared ideological language. The evidence suggests that even ordinary living spaces participated in the same symbolic order as the great ceremonial core. The state did not reserve meaning for the elite precinct and leave the rest of the city spiritually blank. It distributed cosmology through the urban fabric itself. That was a remarkable form of social engineering, not just centralized ritual, but a citywide system of belief that made hierarchy feel normal. This also helps explain why Teotihuacan differs so sharply from the Maya world. Maya kings often proclaimed themselves through inscriptions, portraits, dates, conquests, and named dynasties. Their rulers advertised the ruler's face, the ruler's lineage, the ruler's victories. Teotihuacan, by contrast, seems to have promoted symbols more than personalities. The surviving pattern points toward a corporate or collective style of ideology, one that made the institution larger than any visible individual. Whether power was held by kings whose names are lost, by councils, by priestly coalitions, or by overlapping elite houses, the public result was the same: the city spoke in emblems, not autobiographies. That anonymity may itself have been a political achievement. A ruler with a face can be blamed. A ruler with a lineage can be challenged. But a sacred order can present itself as timeless. It can make hierarchy feel less like domination and more like the natural architecture of the cosmos. That is the psychological bargain Teotihuacan offered. In exchange for order, food systems, ritual protection, work, and identity, the population entered an immense sacred hierarchy. People were not simply ruled, they were incorporated into a story about how the universe remained stable. And yet that bargain carried an edge. The more total the sacred claim, the more dangerous its breakdown. If a city says that it mediates the cosmos, then every crack in that order becomes political and existential at once. That is why Teotihuacan's sacred state matters so much for the larger story. It was not merely a place of temples and offerings. It was a system that translated fear into cohesion, fertility into legitimacy, and ritual violence into obedience. From here, the shadow of that system stretches far beyond central Mexico, into the dynastic battlegrounds of the Maya world, where Teotihuacan's symbols would soon appear like the footprint of a power that refused to stay at home. The sacred machine was assembled at home, but its shadow did not remain at home. By the early centuries AD, Teotihuacan's symbols had begun to travel farther than its stone avenues could explain, and the clearest place to see that reach was the Maya world, a fractured chessboard of dynastic city-states where kings did not merely rule, they performed legitimacy in public record. They carved accessions, victories, captives, gods, and bloodlines into stone. In that political culture, silence was a weakness, authority had to speak, or it risked vanishing from memory. Then came AD 378. On January 16 of that year, according to Maya inscriptions, a figure named Teotihuacan arrived at Tikal, and the event is tied to the death of Tikal's ruler, Teotihuacan, on that same day or in immediate context. The surviving record is abrupt, almost procedural, and that is what makes it so unsettling. The old order at Tikal did not simply decay. It was interrupted. A royal sequence was broken. A political future began under conditions that strongly suggest foreign involvement, or at the very least foreign-backed intervention. At the center of the mystery stands another name that has haunted scholarship for decades: spear-thrower owl. This figure is associated with Teotihuacan-linked imagery and political influence, yet the exact identity, residence, and status remain debated. That uncertainty matters. It blocks the lazy fantasy of a single emperor dispatching armies through the jungle as if ancient Mesoamerica were a Roman frontier. The evidence is not that simple. But the pattern is unmistakable: Teotihuacan possessed a reach strong enough to alter dynastic outcomes far beyond the Basin of Mexico. Soon after, a new dynastic order emerged at Tikal, including Yax Nonahian I, whose legitimacy appears connected to foreign or Teotihuacan-associated prestige. In the Maya world, that kind of connection was not ornamental. It was a political weapon. A ruler linked to a distant and powerful center could claim access to superior war authority, broader cosmic sanction, or a lineage that reached beyond local rivals. Whether the mechanism was direct conquest, elite marriage, hostage exchange, mercenary support, or prestige diplomacy, the result was the same: the throne had been reordered beneath a foreign shadow. And the material evidence reinforces that shadow. Teotihuacan-style military iconography appears in the Maya sphere: atlotls, goggles, Central Mexican dress, talatablero architecture, and war symbolism that clearly did not develop in isolation. The Maya elite were not passive recipients of these forms. They selected them, adapted them, and in some cases weaponized them for their own claims. Some of these signs may point to conquest. Others may point to alliance. Others still may represent the political theater of imitation, where adopting the style of a distant superpower became a way to borrow its authority. That is the strategic brilliance, and the strategic mystery, of Teotihuacan. It may have projected influence through multiple channels at once: military intervention in one place, diplomatic marriage in another, commercial leverage elsewhere, and ideological prestige almost everywhere. Or it may be that Maya rulers themselves adopted Teotihuacan's symbols as a way to strengthen their own claims against local rivals. The surviving pattern allows for competing explanations, and that uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the shape of the evidence. History here is not a verdict handed down from a throne room. It is a battlefield of interpretations. What cannot be denied is the asymmetry of the archives. The Maya wrote about the event. Teotihuacan did not. There is no surviving royal inscription from the city that explains why Siaj Kak came, what bargain stood behind the transfer of power, or whether the event represented conquest, sponsorship, dynastic insertion, or something stranger still. The greatest urban power of central Mexico appears in the Maya record like a force field, felt, feared, and politically decisive, yet almost voiceless. That silence is not a footnote. It is the central clue. A civilization capable of influencing royal succession beyond its own horizon should, in theory, have left a clear political autobiography. Instead, the record points toward a state that hid power inside institutions, or one whose records were never preserved as personal self-praise. And so Teotihuacan becomes one of history's most unsettling contradictions, a city whose reach was continental, whose fingerprints appear in another civilization's dynastic crisis, and whose own account of itself is either lost, concealed, or was never meant to survive in the first place. From that outward thunderclap, the question turns inward. If Teotihuacan could reshape thrones abroad, what pressures were gathering inside the megacity itself? What kind of system projects confidence across Mesoamerica and still leaves behind a silence this deep? The AD 378 shockwave did more than announce Teotihuacan's reach. It revealed the cost of a system that could project influence outward only because immense coordination was being maintained inward. A city of this scale did not survive on stone and spectacle alone. It required a constant choreography of food supply, labor drafts, ritual legitimacy, housing repair, craft production, and elite compromise. When that choreography began to strain, the grandeur could still stand for a while, but the foundations were already losing their integrity. The first pressure was environmental, though not in any simplistic sense. Archaeological evidence and climate studies point toward episodes of drought and agricultural stress across parts of Mesoamerica in the centuries before the collapse. In a civilization built on reliable harvests, that kind of stress is never merely agricultural. It becomes political almost immediately. Food, tribute, labor obligations, and ritual offerings all tighten at once. The state has to ask more from the same population at the very moment the land is giving less. But drought alone does not explain why destruction later concentrates in elite and ceremonial zones. Climate can weaken a society, it does not usually choose where the fire burns. That is where the social structure matters. Teotihuacan's apartment compounds were one of its great inventions, but every invention has a shadow. These dense residential units created neighborhoods with shared labor, shared identity, and shared memory. They also concentrated grievance. A system that organizes thousands of families into standardized urban life can produce cohesion, but it can also produce blocks of people who know exactly where their obligations end and their resentment begins. The city was not a loose sprawl of isolated households. It was a disciplined human lattice. And when a lattice is stressed, fracture can travel through it with terrifying speed. The elite world was no calmer. If Teotihuacan was governed through a corporate arrangement rather than a single kingly face, then power was likely distributed among competing houses, priestly groups, military factions, and administrative brokers. Such systems can be extraordinarily resilient while everyone is receiving enough to cooperate. They become dangerous when prestige, access, and ritual authority begin to narrow. Every faction wants to believe it is defending the city. In practice, each may be defending its own route to command. The higher the civilization rises, the more expensive consensus becomes. External influence may have deepened the strain. Teotihuacan's diplomatic and military reach across Mesoamerica brought tribute, prestige, and access to exotic networks. It also brought risk. Long-distance projection of power often enriches the upper layers first, while the burdens of maintenance fall downward: more production, more labor, more ritual demand, more expectation that the city can dominate more space without paying a domestic price for that ambition. Powerful systems often mistake the obedience of yesterday for the consent of tomorrow. That is one of history's most costly illusions. The surviving pattern points toward a society growing brittle beneath its own magnificence. Later destruction does not seem to have fallen evenly across the city. Instead, the evidence suggests that elite and ceremonial areas were hit especially hard, the very spaces that concentrated administrative authority, ritual command, and symbolic legitimacy. That pattern matters. Fire spreading by accident tends to be indiscriminate. Fire applied to power tends to be selective. It is a political language, not just a physical event. So the question sharpens. If drought strained the fields, if the neighborhoods carried resentment, if elite factions competed for control, and if the city's reach kept demanding more than its interior could safely provide, then what happens when a state built on sacred order can no longer contain its own rival centers of gravity? Not a single catastrophe, but a cascade. Not collapse as a moment, but collapse as a loss of repair. Empires rarely fall because one thing goes wrong. They fall when the repair mechanisms stop working. By the middle of the 6th century, Teotihuacan was entering that dangerous phase in which magnificence itself becomes evidence of fragility. The city had mastered scale, but scale had begun to master the city. Its institutions could still command awe, yet awe is not the same as loyalty. And once legitimacy starts to split from daily life, the grandest buildings become the most tempting symbols to strike. Then the center burned. Then the center burned. Around AD 550, fire and destruction struck the elite, administrative, and ceremonial heart of Teotihuacan, and the pattern of damage was not random. The surviving evidence suggests selectivity. The structures associated with power, ritual authority, and coordination were the ones most heavily targeted. That matters, because accidental fire behaves like disorder. Political violence behaves like judgment. This is the great historical shock of Teotihuacan's collapse. The strongest explanation is not a foreign army storming the gates, but a crisis that rose from within the city's own political body. Archaeologists debate the exact mechanism: internal revolt, a coup among elite factions, the collapse of a corporate regime, or ritual termination carried out as a deliberate destruction of authority. The evidence does not yield a single commander, a single conspiracy, or a clean courtroom verdict. Yet the burn layers, the concentration of destruction in the core, and the targeting of symbolic spaces point toward an act of intentional unmaking. Temples were burned. Administrative areas were damaged. The city's most meaningful architecture was struck as though someone meant not merely to break buildings, but to sever legitimacy from stone. External invasion has often been proposed, because burned capitals invite frontier fantasies. But the archaeology does not reward that simplicity. The destruction appears too selective, too concentrated, too politically readable. If enemies came from outside, they still had to know where the city's commanding heart was. If the violence came from inside, the implication is even more disturbing: the people living within the system may have turned against the system's own organs of command. In that case, Teotihuacan was not conquered in the familiar sense. It was anatomized. And the anonymity of Teotihuacan makes collapse harder to interpret. In a kingdom dominated by a visible monarch, failure can be pinned to a face, a dynasty, a tomb, a statue. Teotihuacan left no such obvious political autobiography. No readable king stands at the center of the disaster, waiting to be blamed. That silence changes the emotional geometry of collapse. Rage, fear, and grievance would not have been directed toward one obvious ruler's image. They would have moved toward palaces, compounds, ritual precincts, and the institutions that had once presented themselves as eternal. When power is hidden inside structures, those structures become the target when trust breaks. That is why the burning around AD 550 feels so severe in the historical record. It was not the extinction of a city in a single night. Cities of this scale die by stages, not instant disappearance. But the blow was decisive. Once the commanding superstructure was broken, the city's influence began to unravel. Population declined over time. Political centrality weakened. The great urban machine still existed, but it no longer commanded the same obedience, the same prestige, or the same gravitational pull. What had once organized central Mexico became a wounded giant, still standing, but no longer able to make its silence sound like certainty. The deeper lesson is that Teotihuacan's power had always depended on coordination as much as spectacle. It had turned labor, belief, housing, production, and sacred order into one immense system. That kind of system can absorb pressure for centuries, but once legitimacy fractures at the center, the whole machine becomes vulnerable in ways that are invisible until the moment of failure. A city can look permanent while depending on fragile compromise. It can appear monumental while remaining politically breakable. And when the institutions that hold it together stop being believable, fire does not merely consume structures. It exposes how much of civilization was trust all along. This is also why the silence of Teotihuacan matters so much. If the city once possessed written records of its rulers, they did not survive in a readable form. If it maintained a political memory, that memory was consumed in the same destruction that attacked its governing spaces. The result is a civilization that seems to vanish into architecture. The stones remain. The political voice does not. So the burning around AD 550 did more than destroy walls and roofs. It shattered the illusion of permanence. It revealed that even a civilization built to look inevitable can contain the seeds of its own fracture, waiting for resentment, factional ambition, or systemic fatigue to turn structure into ruin. Teotihuacan did not fall because it was small. It faltered because it was vast, anonymous, and overburdened by its own design. After the fire, the story does not end. It widens. The city was diminished, the region reorganized, and the legend began to outgrow the state that had produced it. The burning of the center did not erase Teotihuacan in a single stroke. It did something slower, and in a way more revealing. The city remained occupied in reduced form, but the great machine of authority had cracked. Population declined over time. Political centrality drained away. The urban giant that had once organized central Mexico began to live on as a diminished body, haunted by its own former scale. The avenues did not disappear. The monuments did not instantly collapse into oblivion. But the state that had given them meaning was broken, and that is a different kind of death. What followed was not a clean succession, as though one capital simply passed its crown to another. The world after Teotihuacan became more fragmented, more competitive, and in some ways more inventive because no single city again occupied quite the same position. Xochicalco rose with its own ambitious fusion of religion and politics. Cacaxtla appeared with vivid imagery that reflected regional conflict and elite competition. Cholula retained deep sacred authority across long stretches of time. Chulo would later become a center of post-classic memory and power. And across central Mexico, other political landscapes reorganized the vacuum in their own ways. The surviving pattern points toward a broken field of competing inheritances rather than a single heir. Teotihuacan did not bequeath a throne. It left behind a language of legitimacy that others would learn to speak in new accents. That language mattered because Teotihuacan's influence was never only administrative. Its styles, symbols, and sacred prestige survived long after its political silence had begun. Talatablero forms continued to echo beyond the city. Monumental planning remained a benchmark for authority. Warrior imagery, cosmic order, and the sense of a civilization aligned with sacred force did not vanish when the ruling structure failed. They entered circulation. They became portable power. Later peoples did not look at the ruins as inert debris. They read them as evidence that the world had once been organized on a grander scale, and that such ordering might still be recovered. In the ancient world, memory was never passive. It was a charter, a weapon, a claim. That is why the Aztec encounter with the ruins centuries later became so important. The Mexica revered the site, folded it into origin stories, and treated it as a place where cosmic history had been made. The name by which the city is widely known today comes from that later reverence, not from the vanished inhabitants themselves. Teotihuacan became, in Aztec memory, the place of divine creation, a setting for the birth of the gods and therefore a setting for the birth of authority itself. That was not simple nostalgia. It was political theology. By claiming the ruins, the Mexica inherited not just stones, but a version of antiquity that could authorize their own world. The dead city became useful because it could speak for the living. A collapsed capital can become more useful as a myth than it ever was as a bureaucracy. And that is the deepest irony of Teotihuacan. Its own voice is almost absent. No clear royal autobiography survived to explain its founders, its dynasties, or its final quarrels. Yet its built environment spoke so loudly that later civilizations could not ignore it. The city that left no readable throne still dominated the historical imagination. Its silence became evidence. Its architecture became argument. Its ruins became a kind of imperial afterlife, more enduring than any surviving list of kings. For historians, that creates both frustration and warning. A state can lose its administrative center and still live on as symbol. A society can fracture politically and remain potent culturally. A monument can outlast the institutions that ordered its construction, becoming a stage on which later powers perform their own legitimacy. Teotihuacan matters far beyond Mesoamerica because it shows that collapse does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes collapse means transfer from rule to memory, from administration to myth, from power to interpretation. And memory, once armed with stone, can outlive empires. The verdict, then, is stark. And it survives precisely because Teotihuacan left so little direct testimony of its own. This was not a mere city that happened to become large. It was a civilizational machine. Planned, sacred, commercial, and political all at once. A metropolis that converted labor into monument, belief into obedience, and exchange into continental reach. For generations, that machine held. It absorbed migrants, organized production, disciplined neighborhoods, projected influence into distant regions, and may even have hidden authority behind institutions so vast that no single ruler needed to dominate the public record in the manner of the Maya kings who carved their names into stone. That silence is not a footnote. It is the central evidence. Teotihuacan rose by making power feel impersonal, orderly, and inevitable. Its urban design suggested coordination on a scale that no one family could easily monopolize. Its sacred landscape turned administration into destiny. Its economic networks turned trade into leverage. Its multicultural quarters suggest a city that understood diversity not as weakness, but as an asset to be managed, contained, and made useful. In that sense, the city's genius was institutional rather than theatrical. It did not need a loud royal autobiography to prove that it ruled. It made rule itself seem like part of the cosmos. Yet the same qualities that created stability also created fragility. Complexity can absorb pressure for centuries, but only so long as legitimacy continues to circulate through the system. Only so long as food arrives, labor is accepted, elites compromise, and ordinary people still believe the structure is worth maintaining. When those supports begin to fail together, the system does not simply weaken. It turns inward. It becomes vulnerable to the very population it once organized. That is one of history's recurring lessons. Empires rarely collapse because a single thing goes wrong. They collapse when the repair mechanisms stop working. And in Teotihuacan, the collapse was not abstract. Burned layers, destroyed elite sectors, broken ceremonial coherence, and the long decline that followed all point toward a society that could no longer keep its own architecture of power intact. The city did not vanish in a single night, but the commanding logic that made it a superpower was shattered. That is why the ruins remain so unsettling. They are not the remains of a failed town. They are the remains of a system that once made order look eternal. The deeper lesson is human, not merely archaeological. People build cities to defeat uncertainty. They gather bodies, store food, organize labor, and create symbols large enough to make a fragile world feel governable. But every city also concentrates grievance, ambition, dependency, and memory. The more successful the system becomes, the more it hides the tensions that can destroy it. Scale is seductive because it feels like security. Teotihuacan warns that scale can also become a trap. A magnificent way of hiding unresolved conflict until the moment conflict can no longer be hidden. That warning still matters. Modern societies continue to rely on invisible institutions, anonymous authority, supply chains that span continents, mass housing that compresses millions into managed space, and bureaucracies that often speak more in procedure than in personality. These systems are not equivalent to Teotihuacan, but the logic is familiar. Power can become so normalized that it disappears into process. Stability can become so routine that it is mistaken for permanence. And when trust erodes, people often discover that what looked immovable was only densely arranged. Teotihuacan remains, then, as an unanswered question carved into stone. Not merely who ruled it, but whether any civilization can hide power forever. It asks whether a society governed through institutions instead of names becomes stronger, or merely harder to understand when it fractures. It asks why human beings keep building structures meant to outlast fear, only to learn that every structure also stores fear, ambition, and resentment inside its walls. Teotihuacan did not merely go silent, it forced history to interrogate silence as evidence. And that makes it one of the most important civilizations in the ancient world. If this investigation into Teotihuacan's rise and collapse revealed something new, subscribe to Archives of Humanity for more studies of the grand strategies that shaped civilization. And after this, let the next film on the end screen continue the descent into another hidden chapter of the past. Was Teotihuacan's anonymity a strength, or a fatal weakness?